Pollination. The process of transfer of pollen grain from anther towards the stigma is called as pollination. Pollination is a prerequisite process for the fertilization, because without pollination it is not possible at all to achieve the process of a fertilization. So here you can observe pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther towards the stigma of a flower. In the case of pollination, if we observe the prerequisite stage for fertilization, that means during the process of fertilization, that male and female gamete have to come together, they should get unite with each other, but both of those male and female gametes are non-motile. That means they can't move by themselves from one place to the another place. Out of that, if we take firstly the male gamete are developed from the pollen grain. So pollen grains are non-motile and they can be carried usually from the anther towards the stigma with the help of agencies of pollination. We can say the external agents required for the process of transfer of pollen grain from anther towards the stigma. Here you can observe the type of pollination. First one, cell pollination. Cell pollination is a type of a pollination in which the transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of same flower is called as a self-pollination. It results in the process of inbreeding or selfing. Second type of pollination is a cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is a transfer of pollen grain from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower present on same plant or different plants of same species is called as a cross-pollination. Now, if we observe the types of pollination, it can be further divided into three different types on the basis of source of pollination. First one, autogamy. Autogamy means auto means self, gamous means marriage. We have discussed in last year about the gamy. Gamous is an union or also called as a marriage. Auto means self, self marriage, autogamy, self pollination also called as a autogamy. In the case of cell pollination, here you can observe there is a transfer of pollen grain from anther towards the stigma of same flower. That means the flower should be bisexual. So only it is possible in the case of autogamy or cell pollination to transfer the pollen grain from anther of same flower towards the stigma of a same flower. So we say that the process of self pollination. In the case of cell pollination, here you can observe the offspring form are exactly similar to their parents because there is no any kind of a crossing over. You can take an example of a pea plant. Then geitonogamy. Mind it. Geitos means neighbor. Gamous means marriage. Geitonogamy means marriage with the neighbor. So geitonogamy, the condition in which transfer of pollen grain from anther towards the stigma of different flower present on the same plant. Mind it, transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of different flower present on the same plant are or is called as a geitonogamy. Here you can observe it is the transfer of pollen grain towards the stigma of a different flower produced on the same plant. And what we have defined, transfer of pollen grain from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower present on the same plant is called as geitonogamy. Now, here you can observe it is functionally similar to the process of a cross pollination as it involves the agencies of a pollination, but it cannot bring about the genetic variation. Why it cannot bring about the genetic variation? Because only single plant is get engaged in the process of a reproduction and is only of the ecological significance related to the geitonogamy. It is similar to the autogamy as the pollen grains came from the same plant. Example, Cucurbita maxima is an example of what? Geitongamous plant. Mind it, geitonogamy means marriage with the neighbor. So transfer of pollen grain from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower present on same plant is called as a geitonogamy. The next, xenogamy. Mind it, xenos means stranger, Gammas means marriage. So marriage with the stranger, it is called as a xenogamy, also called as a cross pollination, or also called as a process of outbreeding. In the case of xenogamy, here you can observe is a type of cross pollination when pollen grain of one flower is deposited on the stigma of another flower present on another plant but belonging to the same species is called as a xenogamy. In autogamy, we have studied transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of same flower. In geitonogamy, we have studied transfer of pollen grain from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower present on same plant. And now in xenogamy, we are going to discuss transfer of pollen grain from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower present on another plant. But this another plant is belonging to the same species is called as xenogamy. Now, with the help of agencies of pollination, it is possible to transfer the pollen grain from anther towards the stigma of another plant, another flower present on the another plant. It is helpful to generate the variations. So the offspring formed during the process of xenogamy, they show certain variation. Now, for the process of transfer of pollen grain, there is a requirement of pollinating agents. This is an xenogamy. Next one is an hybridization. Mind it, here is an artificial process of pollination in which there is a transfer of pollen grain from anther of one flower towards the stigma of another flower present on another plant of different species. Now here not of the same species, are of different species, but these two species are closely related to each other. As we can say, the two different species of cotton are bring together to form a new hybrid plant. Two different species of rice or crop plant are bring together to form someone new type or new variety of the plant. Here you can take an example of texamati. When there is an process of hybridization is performed in between the semi-dwarf variety of rice with basmati variety, which gave us a new variety or new type of the plant as a result of what? Hybridization. So here the definition is given about the hybridization is a type of a cross pollination when pollen grain of one flower is deposited on the stigma of another flower of different plant belonging to the closely related species. Here the process of hybridization. The next, agencies of pollination.